Hi, my name is Gracelyn Steigerwald, and I will be presenting the complex issue of hostile architecture in big cities. Hostile architecture has been identified worldwide, but especially targeted in big cities due to higher volume of tourist attractions compared to small towns or countries that aren't popular vacation destinations. Okay, first I just want to introduce what I'm not going to define yet what anti-homeless architecture is, but I would just like to introduce the topic a little bit. Hostile architecture particularly targets the homeless population. On the contrary, hostile architecture benefits the larger cities due to the idea that tourists are more likely to go to a city that has less homeless population. This is typically due to the stigmatization that homeless people are dangerous and crime typically follows them. This presentation would be most beneficial in the city council setting. My audience would be the city council, typically because they hold meetings weekly and have an open forum section for the public to discuss public issues. Um, Presentations to the city council aren't always arguing one side compared to the other, but presenting an issue of the citizens. In this presentation, you should expect to learn about the worldwide perspective of hostile architecture, examples, the outlooks between the two groups, and advocacy groups. Okay, now to define hostile architecture. There are many nicknames for hostile architecture, like anti-homeless architecture, defensive architecture, or exclusionary design, and there's many more. Typically, according to the Urbanist 101 and described in many other resources, hostile architecture can be hard to define as it appears in different ways throughout every city. It looks different in every town and even in every country. On the other hand, peer-reviewed articles from scholars state that there is no agreed on definition. That is why there's no definition, not because it appears in different ways, but that just nobody has collectively agreed on a definition. And that was stated in a Dayfine linked peer-reviewed article. Um, and it's specified as urban design strategy in the architecture field. So hostile architecture isn't just a concept, but it's actually a design strategy for many cities. And then a quote definition of hostile architecture. It was tough to find one throughout my research, but I pulled one from the Neighborhood Design Center. In their 2023 article, they state public spaces and structures are used to prevent certain activities or restrict certain people from using those spaces. Um, and the definition and design strategy doesn't specifically target the homeless population by definition, but it is the population that is the most affected. So in this definition, you can see that they don't specifically state homeless homeless people being affected by this. That's why a lot of people will use the term hostile architecture or defensive architecture compared to the anti-homeless architecture term, which arguably anti-homeless architecture is more of the common name you'll see be referenced as compared to defensive architecture, exclusionary design. Now I just wanted to show you some examples of hostile architecture as the definition is hard to describe. First there are these benches. These benches have dividers in them, and the defense purpose is to stop people from lying in the bench and adding the amount of seats for citizens. Next would be right here. This is the spikes on doorsteps. This is typically in more of the private setting or along a strip of a city. These spikes typically aren't sharp, but would obviously be very painful to lie on, or just take a seat on a step to get some shade. A purpose of this is to remove the association of homelessness in the business or to give room for people to enter the business if for some reason somebody would be sitting on that step during open hours. And then next one, this one right here, is typically argued by most resources and arguments as the most unethical. These are spikes under a bridge, so this is a passway right here, and then there's spikes all under here. Um, Bridges typically allow homeless people to have shade in the summer or block the wind in even the cold weather. So there is really no purpose for the spikes other than to attack the homeless citizens' shelters. As typically this picture isn't a great representation, but typically underneath of a bridge is pretty much out of the eyesight from the public. And then this is just some more pictures. These are more extreme examples, but you see them more commonly in like larger cities like New York City or Seattle is a big city for anti-homeless architecture. This first one is a bench that obviously goes in a lot of different ways, um, which arguably is almost a bench that you couldn't sit in even if you weren't trying to sleep on it. It looks kind of uncomfortable on how to sit on that. And then second, in the big cities that have limited grass of where homeless people can sit down, they might climb into trees to get off of the hot pavement, and so they have added spikes to trees. I also wanted to talk a little bit about this video. Obviously, for the sake of time, I won't be playing this video, but I think this is a great video representation of anti-homeless architecture around New York City. The creator of this is named Cash Jordan. He is a YouTuber who's native to New York City. He interviews and shows real-world representation of anti-homeless architecture. I've attached the URL, so if you're interested in finding out more information, you can click the link or type it into your browser. I'll also attach it to the YouTube video description. Next, I just want to look at the different outlooks between the city and the homeless. First, I'm going to start with the city's outlook. Some of the main benefits for the city is that the financial outcomes would be beneficial and increase due to the increase in tourism. Cities fear that crime turns tourists away, so that means they must push out the environmental factors that are causing this effect, which would be the homeless people um, in this definition. People in businesses also don't want to move to cities with low tourism and high crime, so this would also help with those preventable matters. And then I will discuss more when discussing the other side of the argument, but there is a big discussion of morality in this case, and the hostility towards the public. So, according to De Fine Licht, hostility is defined in psychological terms of being attitudinal or a behavioral construct. This also discusses having a deep-seated ill will towards someone. Um, so, by definitions, cities can defend that the architecture type isn't considered ill will or trying to harm any people, but more of a preventative matter um, that would accommodate for more people. So it's not trying to attack a group, but trying to prevent less people from walking away from the city due to a certain aspect of the city. So, according to Chulu, though, There is also an argument on the definition of public space and the accessibility. One side can argue that the architecture is removing the accessibility from the homeless population, while on the other hand, homeless citizens may be preventing the accessibility to the general public by taking up a bench or being camped out on the doorstep. So this discussion of accessibility and hostility are the main arguments behind the city's outlook. And now, if we want to discuss the homeless citizens' outlook, um, some struggles within the homeless community is finding shelter and protecting themselves from the elements at night or during the day in extreme summer and winter months. Um, and as I start on this slideshow, that the biggest argument is that it is inhumane. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, hostile architecture can be defined as a form of segregation as it separates the homeless community from the rest of the general population. And this isn't them purposely making laws to segregate them, but having certain architecture that makes them not being able to stay in the city. It can also be argued from the homeless citizens' outlook that the architecture can be public benefit, which cannot be a proper argument due to public meaning everybody, and there's a large group of people that is separated from it. So what this is saying is that the city is saying that the public benefit would be to remove the anti the home excuse me the homeless citizens from the cities as it allows more people and feel more comfortability going into the cities. But they can't say it's a public benefit as the homeless citizens aren't part of that public. Next, I just want to discuss the National Coalition of Homeless. They're the main advocacy group surrounding this issue. And a lot of my information and resources, or a lot of my information does come from the National Coalition of Homelessness, along with many of peer-reviewed articles just discussing the topic in general. The NCH is actually one of the only resources I found during my research that uses direct information and information from the homeless and not through studies. Um, this has been an issue with many studies over the years, as you can like see this through autism studies or developmental disabilities, that they just don't include the population in the studies that is the one being affected. The NCH breaks that wall and includes the homeless population in this research, which I think is very beneficial. It is also a nonprofit organization that is just trying to fight for the rights of homeless community. Their main fight is to end homelessness, but as that will be a task for very many years, they're just currently fighting for the rights, and making them more comfortable in the world that they have to live in. They also offer a lot of resources on their websites, for people who are experiencing homelessness suddenly, or if there's a likelihood that they'll experience it in the future. Let's see. And the effect of all this and the current standing of hostile architecture is increasing, and it is trickling into private businesses. This is mainly due to the fact that it is still a very limited research topic that isn't being discussed enough. Um, and so there's not really anybody fighting for the homeless community, but more just but more standing with the city. There is also an increasing number of cities worldwide that including the defensive architecture like London, Canada, and many more. The cost for the increase and change of infrastructure have increased in cities' budgets. According to the NCH, the New York City's Metropolitan Transit Authority spent $74 million on leaning bars and benches between 2015 to 2019. On the other hand, some cities like Vancouver, Singapore, Uruguay, etc., have adopted the inclusive design. Um, these inclusive designs include long benches, sheltering benches, and sleeping pods under the bridges. Here are some examples of the inclusive designs. On the left, you can see the sheltered benches. These are the pods under the bridges, and this is actually a picture from London of their shelter that is very limited but utilizes the space well. And here are the references.